A trial of fire. The chamber walls shimmered with heat. Flames roared just beneath the floor. The trial of fire had begun. Lyra stood at the edge of the ancient stone path, staring at the burning steps ahead. She was tall, armored in traditional silver scale, and her violet eyes burned with pride. This was her people's rite of passage. A trial of pain, endurance, and strength one no outsider had ever survived. Many from her own world didn't make it past the halfway point. This was the final test to become a high guardian of her world. Veltrax, and next to her, of all things, stood a human. He didn't wear armor. He didn't have claws or thick skin or wings to resist the heat. Just a black shirt, some pants, and a small bag slung across his shoulder. His name was Dan. Plain, soft-spoken, harmless. At least, that's what everyone had thought. Lyra glanced sideways, sneering. "You shouldn't be here." Dan only smiled. "Then let's see what happens." A loud horn echoed through the chamber. The trial had begun. Lyra ran forward first, stepping onto the stone path. The flames below surged, licking at her legs as she moved with fast, trained steps. She focused, breathing through the pain. Her people had done this for generations. She was born to complete it. Behind her, she expected to hear Dan scream or stumble, but she heard footsteps. Light, calm footsteps. She looked back. Dan was walking, as if taking a stroll in a park. The fire danced around him, but it didn't seem to touch him. His expression was relaxed, even amused. The Watcher's elders and trainees were silent. "How are you not burning?" Lyra shouted. Dan just grinned. "You ever been to Nevada in summer?" She didn't understand. Was it a joke? Was this how humans worked, laughing in the face of death? Lyra clenched her fists and picked up the pace. Stone by stone, she pushed. Ahead, the next section of the path was covered in spikes and hot mist. Her armor started to glow red. She ignored the sting and charged through. Dan was still behind her. Calm, easy steps. He moved like he belonged there. He didn't attack. He didn't taunt. He didn't even seem serious. That made her angrier than insults. Halfway through the path, the floor began to shift. Plates moved apart, creating gaps. Lava bubbles hissed. In the spaces below, Lyra leaped, rolled, and climbed. Her breathing grew heavy. Her armor was burning. Her heart pounded. Down. He simply jumped from stone to stone, light and sure. "You think this is easy?" Lyra shouted over the roar of fire. "I don't think," Dan replied. "I just trust my steps." Again, that maddening calm. Lyra reached the final section. The bridge was collapsing slowly, piece by piece. Only one could finish. That's how it always worked. Either someone failed or someone fell. But as Lyra sprinted toward the end, Dan suddenly slowed down. He paused. "You go first," he said gently. Lyra stopped in shock. "What?" He nodded. "Go. Finish it. You've earned it." She stared at him, unsure if it was a trick. Then, without another word, she leaped across the last two stones and reached the final platform. The flames died. Silence. Then, a loud chime. Completion. Victory. Dan stepped forward slowly, landing beside her just before the final platform cracked behind him. He smiled again, not even breathing hard. Elders ran down the chamber stairs shouting, "It's impossible. No human has ever done it." One of the oldest guardians stepped forward, voice shaking. "This trial was created for our kind." "How? Did you survive it?" Dan looked at Lyra, still smiling. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't beat the fire with strength. You beat it by knowing how not to be afraid of it." Lyra stood still, watching him. Her pride was broken, but in its place, something else began to rise. Respect. The smile that changed everything. The chamber remained quiet. Lyra stood beside Dan on the final platform, her body trembling not from pain, but from confusion. She had trained her whole life to survive that trial. And this human, this ordinary-looking man, had walked through it like it was nothing. No armor, no fear, just a smile. The elders whispered among themselves. Some were angry. Others looked curious. A few stared at Dan like he was some strange spirit. One of the younger trainees broke the silence. He didn't even fight. How can that be victory? An elder answered without turning, eyes still locked on Dan. He didn't need to fight. That's what makes it more terrifying. Dan stepped down from the platform and looked at Lyra. You all right? She didn't reply. Her throat felt dry. Her muscles were shaking. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt like the world she knew was cracking under her feet. She had called him weak. She had believed he wouldn't last more than a few steps. Now, she wasn't sure if she had just witnessed magic madness, or something even more powerful. Later, in the Hall of Stone where champions were honored, Dan sat on the edge of a bench, swinging his legs like a bored tourist. Lyra sat across from him, silent. She had removed her armor, revealing burns on her arms and legs. Dawn, meanwhile, didn't have a single mark. How did you do it? She finally asked. Dan looked up. Do what? Walk through that fire, the lava, the spikes, like you were walking through wind. He gave a small chuckle. Honestly, I grew up working in boiler rooms. Grew used to heat early. My skin doesn't burn easy anymore. That's not an answer. Okay, he said, leaning forward. Then here's another answer. I watched your people train for weeks. I studied the timing of the fire bursts, the movement of the platforms. It's all a pattern. I just followed the rhythm. Lyra stared. You memorized the whole sequence? Dan shrugged. I figured I'd need to. I'm not as strong or fast as you. I had to rely on something else. Your mind? Dan tapped his head. It's not about being better, just different. That word stuck in her heart. Different. Not weaker, not stronger, just another path. Lyra looked down at her hands. My people said no outsider could ever finish that trial. You've made them look like fools. Dan shook his head. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone. I just wanted to prove one thing. What? He smiled again, that same calm, irritating smile. That there's more than one way to win. And sometimes, kindness is stronger than fire. Lyra blinked. Kindness? Dan nodded. I could have rushed ahead, beat you to the finish, taken the glory. But I saw how hard you were pushing. You deserved to finish first. She felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. Not from fire, but from something far more dangerous. Admiration. Outside, a crowd had started to form. Word had spread. A human had completed the trial of fire. Whispers turned to chants. Many were angry. Others were in awe. Some feared what this meant. One of the elder guards entered the hall. The council wants to see you both. Now? Lyra asked. Double quotes. Yes. They are not pleased. Dan stood and stretched. All right, let's go. As he walked past Lyra, she found herself standing beside him, not in competition, but in alliance. For the first time in her life, Lyra wasn't walking ahead of someone. She was walking beside them, and something told her, deep inside. Her trials were just beginning. Voices in the council hall. The council hall of Veltrax was not a place for comfort. It was a place of judgment, cold, tall, and built from dark stone that echoed every footstep like a warning. Massive torches lined the walls, but even their fire could not warm the air inside. Lyra walked beside Dan, her jaw tight, heart pounding. She had stood before the council many times, But this was different. Now, she wasn't just a warrior, she was standing beside a human who had broken their sacred trial. Dan, meanwhile, looked as calm as ever. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes moving around like he was sightseeing. "You're not nervous?" she whispered. Dan smiled. "A little. But if I act nervous, they'll think I'm guilty of something." Lyra narrowed her eyes. "They do think that." At the end of the hall, 7 tall chairs formed a semicircle. The High Council sat in silence, their faces stern and unblinking. In the center was Elder Varn, the oldest and most respected member. His eyes were sharp like cold steel. "Step forward," Varn said. Lyra and Dan obeyed. "You both completed the trial of fire," Varn continued. "That much is clear. But one of you is not of this world. That changes things." Dan raised a brow. "How so?" Varn leaned forward. "The trial is meant to test Veltraxian warriors, not outsiders. You've disrespected our tradition." Dan nodded slowly. "I understand, but I didn't cheat. I didn't break anything. I just followed the path." Another counselor, Elder Myra, spoke. "You walked through it like it was a game." Dan looked her straight in the eyes. "And yet, it's not my fault. The test didn't know how to stop someone like me." The room went silent. Lyra stepped forward. "He could have finished first, but he let me pass. He showed honor." Varn turned to her. "You defend him?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Because I saw the trial beat stronger fighters. I've watched it destroy proud warriors." He walked through it, not with force, but with understanding. Myra scoffed. "Then the trial is flawed." "No," Lyra replied. "It simply met someone it couldn't measure." Dan looked at her, eyes wide. That was the first time she had stood up for him, and he hadn't expected it. Varn stood slowly. "This is a delicate moment. The people are divided. Some say we must ban all outsiders from our trials. Others say this is a new beginning." Dan waited quietly. Finally, Varn turned toward him. "Tell me, human, what do you want from us? Glory? Power? A title?" Dan smiled gently. "None of that. I came because I was curious. I saw a challenge and wanted to learn. That's it." The answer seemed to confuse them all. "You risked your life just to learn?" Myra asked. "Yes, because sometimes learning is the reward." There was a long silence. The council whispered among themselves. Lyra stepped closer to Dan. "They don't know what to do with someone like you." Dan smiled sideways. "That's usually how it starts." Finally, Varn raised his hand. "You have not broken our rules. And the girl speaks truth. You showed restraint and respect, so we will not punish you." Dan exhaled. "But," Varn added, "there are those who will not accept this. You will be watched, challenged, maybe worse." Dan's smile didn't fade. "Let them come." Varn studied him for a long moment. "Very well. Then let history show on this day. A human completed the trial of fire." The council stood and exited the room slowly. Lyra and Dan were left alone in the hall. "You smiled even when they threatened you," Lyra said. "It's just how I survive," Dan replied. "Smiling makes people wonder what you know." Lyra chuckled softly. "That smile might be more dangerous than a sword." Dan turned toward her, voice calm. "Then stay close. I'll teach you how to use it." She didn't answer, but for the first time, she smiled back. The challenge. The next morning. The air around the training grounds buzzed with tension. Word had spread beyond the capital. Not just on Veltrax, but to off-world colonies. A human had completed the trial of fire. Whispers turned to debates. Debates turned to outrage. To some, Dan was a legend already. To others, he was an insult. Lyra walked through the barracks with her armor half buckled, nodding to other warriors. Some looked away, some stared at her with hard eyes. A few muttered behind her back. She didn't care. What she saw in that trial had changed her. And Dan? He had done the impossible, with a smile and no armor. She found him where she expected, sitting on the edge of a wall, legs dangling, tossing a small rock in the air like a bored child. "You're too relaxed," she said. Dan caught the rock mid-air and grinned. "I was told to stay out of the way. This is me staying out of the way." "You know someone's going to challenge you," she warned. "They think you embarrassed our warriors." He nodded. "Yeah, I figured." Just then, a loud voice echoed through the grounds. "Human, face me." Both turned. A massive warrior stepped forward. His name was Korvac, a powerful fighter with a record of 60 victories in the arena. His horns were sharpened, his body covered in deep scars. Behind him stood dozens of soldiers, all watching with hungry eyes. Asterisk, "I challenge you in the name of Veltrax," Korvac roared. "Your trial was a trick. Face me in combat." Dan slowly stood. "That's not how it works." "It is now," Korvac growled. "If you are a warrior, you fight." Lyra stepped forward. "Dan doesn't need to prove anything." "This is not about proving," Korvac said. "It's about honor." Dan looked at Lyra, then stepped past her. "I accept," he said calmly. Crowd murmured. Korvac sneered. "You have no armor, no weapon." Dan smiled. "I didn't have those in the trial of fire either." A ring was quickly formed. Warriors circled the open space. Elders gathered at the edges, but none interfered. They wanted to see. Korvac charged first. A blur of muscle and fury. Dan sidestepped. Korvac missed by inches, skidding across the dirt. He turned and came again, fists flying. Dan dodged, bent, rolled, never attacking, just moving. Lyra watched with wide eyes. Dan was dancing through the fight, his body light, fast, fluid. Korvac grew angrier, swinging harder, louder. But Dan didn't even breathe heavy. And then, with perfect timing, Dan stepped in. He placed one hand on Korvac's shoulder, used the alien's own force, and flipped him over onto his back. The ground shook. Silence followed. Asterisk. Dan stepped back, still smiling. "You rely too much on strength. You forget balance." Korvac growled, but didn't rise. He knew he had been beaten. A voice broke the silence. Elder Myra. "How did you do that?" Dan turned. "I learned judo as a kid. Momentum over muscle." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They just stared, confused, impressed, uncertain. Lyra stepped forward and placed a hand on Dan's shoulder. "You keep smiling," she whispered, "but now they're starting to see the fire behind it." Dan turned to her and whispered back, "That's the idea." For the first time in Veltrax's history, a human had not only passed their sacred trial, but now stood undefeated in combat. The galaxy would hear of this. And not everyone would be pleased. Asterisk. Whispers beyond the stars. By nightfall, the stars above Veltrax shone like sharp eyes watching from beyond the sky. News of the humans' victory, both in the trial of fire and the duel, had spread far beyond the planet, across channels and data streams. Dan's name was whispered on stations and colonies light years away. Some called him a trickster, others a warrior in disguise. But to Lyra, he was something else entirely, a question. They sat on a cliff overlooking the flame-lit city. Below, torches glowed like stars on the ground. Wind stirred Lyra's hair as she spoke without turning. "Don't belong here," she said quietly. Dan looked up at the sky. "Maybe not, but I didn't come here to fit in." She nodded slowly. "Still, you've shaken the core of everything we believed in." "Then maybe it needed shaking." Lyra turned her gaze on him. "They fear you now." You don't fight like us. You don't speak like us. And yet, you won. Don picked up a stone, tossed it gently into the air, then caught it. I didn't come to fight anyone. I just wanted to understand. And now? Now I want to make sure your people understand us. Before she could reply, a small drone buzzed toward them, silver, disc-shaped, carrying the red crest of the Veltrax Council. It stopped mid-air, projected a blue light, and a voice echoed out. This message is for Dan of Earth. You are summoned to the Star Council station orbiting Veltrax. Arrival required within 20 hours. Reason: diplomatic hearing. The drone beeped once and flew off. Lyra stood. They're escalating this. Don sighed. Of course they are. A human beating ancient trials and top warriors? It was only a matter of time. Lyra looked tense. They won't just question you. They'll try to silence you. Dan stood too, brushing dust from his hands. And I'll have to smile harder. Lyra almost laughed, but stopped herself. You're not afraid? He shrugged. I am. But fear doesn't mean you stop walking. She stepped closer. You can't go in alone. They won't play fair. Dan looked at her gently. You're coming with me? Lyra nodded. This started with my world. I have a responsibility now. The two walked down the slope, their shadows long against the rocks. Elsewhere, on the dark side of the moon, hidden transmitters came to life. Across military frequencies, encrypted messages were sent. The human has passed every test. He cannot be allowed to reach the Star Council. Intercept and neutralize. Unseen eyes turned toward Veltrax's skies. Lyra and Dan didn't know it yet, but they weren't just part of a trial anymore. They had become the spark of something much bigger. Asterisk. Ambush in the stars. The shuttle lifted from Veltrax with a soft rumble, breaking through the planet's clouds and slicing into orbit. Inside the cockpit, Lyra sat at the controls while Dan checked the ship's sensors. The journey to the Star Council station was only a few hours, but both of them knew the real danger wasn't the travel. It was who would be waiting. Or what? Lyra glanced at Dan. You sure about this? Dan smirked slightly. No, but since. When has that stopped me? She shook her head. You're either brave or the most reckless being I've ever met. Can't I be both? Before she could reply, the warning lights blinked red. Ship approaching, Dan said, tapping the console. Not broadcasting any identity code. Lyra frowned. Pirates? No. His voice turned serious. Too fast. Too clean. Suddenly, the ship jolted. Outside, a sleek black fighter appeared Veltrax design, but with no official markings. It fired again, missing by inches. They're trying to disable us, Lyra shouted. This isn't a warning. It's an ambush. Dan jumped into the gunner seat. Told you they wouldn't play fair. More blasts rocked the shuttle as two more ships joined the chase. Hang on. Lyra twisted the ship sharply, pulling them into a narrow debris field from an old orbital ring. Metal shards and dead satellite husks flew past the viewports. Dan locked on and fired, striking the nearest attacker's wing. It spun off course, smoke trailing behind it. One down, he muttered. They're not giving up. Lyra warned Dot as the two remaining fighters closed in. Dan opened a private comm frequency. Station command. This is Shuttle Orin requesting emergency docking. Clearance hostile ships in pursuit. The comm crackled. Asterisk double quotes. Acknowledged. Landing Bay 4 is open. Come in fast. We're locking you through. Lyra kicked in the boosters. The shuttle roared forward as weapons fire chased their tail. Almost there, 10 seconds. Dan shouted. Another. Blast struck their hull, causing alarms to scream. Then, ahead, the great Star Council station appeared massive and glowing, like a floating crown above Veltrax. Lyra aimed straight for the open docking bay. Brace! The shuttle burst through the shield barrier and slammed into the docking platform, just as the bay doors sealed shut behind them. The enemy ships veered away, disappearing into the void. Smoke hissed from the shuttle's sides as emergency teams rushed forward. Dan stood slowly. Well, that was a warm welcome. Lyra glanced at him. You still smiling? He gave a crooked grin. Barely. As they stepped off the shuttle, a group of armed guards approached, surrounding them. At the center stood a council envoy in dark red robes. You're late, the envoy said coldly. Asterisk. Dan wiped blood from a small cut on his temple. Someone tried to make sure we never arrived. The envoy's expression didn't change. Then you'll understand why security will be tight. Lyra stepped forward. We need answers now. Who ordered the attack? The envoy raised an eyebrow. That's what the hearing is for. Dan nodded slowly. Then let's get to it. But deep inside, he knew something wasn't right. The ambush wasn't random. It was coordinated. And the way the envoy spoke, he knew more than he was saying. The trial wasn't over. It had just entered a new arena. Asterisk. The smile that shook the council, the star council chamber, was built to impress. Giant pillars stretched into the vaulted ceiling. Glowing emblems of every major species lit the walls. Dozens of high-ranking leaders from across the galaxy filled the seats. Valtraxians, Serani, Tharn, and more. At the center stood a single circular platform. Dan walked toward it alone. Lyra stood at the edge of the chamber with 2 guards beside her. She had protested, but the council had insisted only the human would speak. A booming voice echoed across the hall. Dan of Earth, you've been called here to explain your actions. You broke sacred tradition. You embarrassed warriors. You disrupted peace. Dan raised his eyes calmly. I walked a path your people created. I followed the rules. And I didn't come to make enemies, just to understand. Murmurs filled the chamber. A Tharn general sneered. You disrespected the trial of fire. Dan shook his head. I respected it enough to survive it. Maybe more than those who failed it for generations. Another elder, cloaked in silver, leaned forward. And then you defeated Veltrax's champion in open combat. He attacked me. I defended myself. The council chamber went silent again. Dan looked around, slowly turning his gaze toward each representative. You call me a problem because I smiled through your trials. Because I didn't scream. Because I didn't break. But what scares you isn't how I passed your tests. It's how easily I did it. Several leaders stiffened. You built a galaxy where strength is measured by scars, where honor means blood. But what if someone wins without violence? What if someone walks through your fire without fear? He smiled again. Lyra saw it from across the room. That same smile that had once annoyed her now made her chest tighten with pride. Dan continued, voice steady. You fear me because I represent something different. A way of thinking you can't control. But I'm not here to conquer or take power. He raised a single hand. Asterisk. I'm here to remind you that humans don't need claws or horns to survive. We endure. We adapt. And sometimes we win with a smile. Gasps echoed across the chamber. Some were stunned. Some enraged. Others impressed. An old Veltrax elder slowly stood. I saw him walk through the trial of fire. I saw no trickery. No shortcuts. Just calm. And clarity. Another voice followed. Perhaps this human has earned something greater than punishment. The council argued for what felt like hours. Voices clashed. Factions split. But in the end, the vote was called. The final decision? Dan was cleared of all charges. He would not be punished. His victory would be recorded in Veltrax history. And more importantly, A new trial path would be created for all species, including humans. As Dan stepped off the platform, Lyra rushed to him. "You really weren't afraid?" She whispered. "Oh, I was terrified," he said with a grin. "I just didn't let it show." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You didn't just survive our trial. You changed what it means." Dan chuckled. "All I did was walk through fire and smile." Lyra smirked. "That smile is going to start wars." He looked around the chamber and shrugged. "Then I guess we'd better be ready to end them." They walked out of the chamber together, side by side, not as warrior and outsider, but as equals carrying a spark that would soon ignite a new chapter for the entire galaxy. The end.